Detroit. And I have a template and I just change it on the plane. So I changed it. But you'll see, I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of old friends. I'm really glad that and heartwarmed that you've come to hear me speak, even though you've probably heard this before. I should say, I've heard it before too, and I still enjoy it. But that when I'm speaking to professional groups, and particularly a group like this one, that knows so much of this stuff already, I make the point, it was actually an interesting process. Like, I read and I listened and I learned like what I thought was the best way that all these messages were being communicated by others, sometimes me, mostly others. And then I put them all in the book, Walkable City, and then I memorized the book, and now I speak from the book. And what that means is that I'm hopeful, because I give this talk probably every 2 weeks somewhere in the US. I'm hopeful that what I'm about to present to you isn't just some stuff that you might learn from, but that if you already know most of it, I'm presenting it in a way that perhaps you might want to adopt for yourself. Because I think that I figured out the best way to sell, or I really learned from my colleagues and all of you, the best way to sell these ideas. So if you're not listening to the text, listen to the meta text and the rhetoric that I found is very effective in selling these messages around the US and actually elsewhere as well. I guess I can just look from here. Here I can see what's on my screen. So I give talks on how to be walkable, and I give talks about why to be walkable, and I do find it's very useful to talk about my discovery as a planner, that there were these 3 other groups arguing for walkability that had much more compelling arguments than we had. That being the economists, the environmentalists, and the epidemiologists. And I found that it's much easier to sell walkability when you make those 3 arguments. And in fact, the first part of Walkable City is called Why Walkability, and it's 3 chapters. One on economics, which is principally inspired by Chris Leinberger's work. One on climate, which was actually principally inspired by Green Metropolis by David Owen. And one on health, which was principally inspired by urban sprawl and public health by Frumkin, Frank, and Jackson. So what are the 3? Oh, and by the way, so I'm going to do these 3 things in 5 minutes, but I've got a TED Talk that's 17 minutes, that if you just go to TED and put my name in, with a K at the end, you will find it. And a lot of cities actually start this conversation by sitting folks down around a monitor and showing the TED Talk. And by the way, there's 2 TED Talks. There's this TED Talk, which is the Why Walkability, despite the vague title. And there's another TED Talk that is more like the talk that you're going to get today, that is the How Walkability. And that's a TEDx talk, and it's called The General Theory of Walkability. So I would recommend that one for your use as well. So the first conversation, the economic conversation, there's so much to be said, but principally, the way that I like to frame it is that between 1970 and 2010, we roughly doubled the number of roads in this country. And in 1970, we spent 10% of our income on transportation as a nation. And in 2010, we spent 20% of our income on transportation. So what this reorientation around the concept of mandatory automobile enslavement has brought us is that we're spending so much more of our national wealth on just getting around, when it didn't have to be that way. I like to mention that working Americans, as defined by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, spend a little bit more, but it's more, on transportation than they spend on housing. And poor Americans, also as so defined, are spending about 40% of their income on transportation. Because we've created this landscape in which we're burdened by the use of the automobile. That's the sad part of the story. The happy part of the story, which you find in books like The Option of Urbanism by Chris Leinberger, is that people want to live in cities now. As Chris says, my generation was raised on Happy Days and Brady Bunch and Partridge Family, these suburban shows, but the generation that's coming up was raised on Friends and Seinfeld and Sex and the City and How I Met Your Mother, and they all aspire to live in urban places. And so the future of you know that cities are generating not just more the inner cities, the centers of cities, even cities that have lost population, like Detroit, between the 2000 and 2010 census, gained population in their urban cores, because so many people want that quality of life. And then, of course, we learn also that the denser, the more urban a place is, the more generations of patents per capita, and just the more talent that you attract. So that's a very quick version of the economic argument. The environmental argument is a CNU. You've probably heard this before, but now what we talk about, it used to be the environmental movement. Now it's just climate change. What do we do about climate change? And these initial carbon maps, if you know about the work that the Center for Neighborhood Technology did, these old carbon maps used to map carbon per square mile. And then Center for Neighborhood Technology, longtime CNU member, asked the question, is that the right way to map carbon? And no, it isn't. Because there are only so many of us in this country at any given time, and we can live where we have a bigger carbon footprint or a smaller carbon footprint. And when you measure per household, this is Chicago, right? Hottest in the city center, coldest in the exurbs. When you map per household, the map just reverses itself. And actually, the more urban a place you live, the lighter your footprint. And what the environmentalists are now saying, and this is a movement that was historically anti-city. In the US and its history, it's been an anti-city movement. And the environmentalists are now saying, if you want to save the environment, then stay the hell away from it, right? Live in a city, and the denser the better. And then finally, the health argument, we've done a lot. Everyone knows, that, this is the book that I say the best day to be a planner in America was August 7th, 2004, when this book came out. And basically these epidemiologists, or two epidemiologists and a planner, Larry Frank, who spoke at CNU probably 8 years ago, said, we have the first generation of Americans who are expected to live shorter lives than their parents, and it's because we have basically engineered out of existence the useful walk. And everyone talks about how diet is related to obesity, and obesity is causing us all of these health problems, and that fully 1/3 of all children born after 2000 are expected to become diabetic. But what these doctors figured out is that inactivity was as big a factor, if not greater, than diet, and also inactivity was geographical. And we have now, what are they called? Obesogenic neighborhoods. And if you live in a sprawling area, you're twice as likely to be overweight and have the associated illnesses than if you live in a non-sprawling area. And then there's this fact. This is a health issue, car deaths per year per 100,000. And, cities, of course, are safer than suburbs, and suburbs are safer than exurbs. But New York is 3.9, San Francisco is 4.0, Chicago is 6.0, Detroit's 12.4. The more people drive in a city and the faster they're driving, and the more they're dependent on driving, and the more of the streets that are highways, the more deaths you have. And this is a lot of deaths. This is the single greatest killer of healthy people in our country. And we just ignore it because we naturalize it. We think that it's somehow just part of our life. But in fact, it's vastly different based on where you choose to live or how you design your cities. So that's the why walkability argument, which there's so much more to say, but I found those arguments to be very compelling. We get into the how to do it, and we start with this presumption, and you can say thriving, you can say healthy, you can say, sustainable, right? You can say economically vital. But if we believe this, then how do you get people to walk? And that leads to what we call the general theory of walkability, a little tongue-in-cheek, but it is a theory, which is a hypothesis that's been repeatedly tested and refined based on experiences in place after place. And what we think, and I didn't invent this, I learned this from New Urbanists. There's probably another category we could add, but the simplest way to describe it is that, in America, in which driving is so easy and so cheap, and you don't pay the full cost of driving, and the car is sitting there in the driveway between you and everything, it's just so easy to fall into. The fixed costs are so high, and the marginal costs of using the vehicle are so low. In fact, 4/5 of the cost of owning a car is just owning it, and 1/5 is driving it. So in that scenario, there's just this temptation to drive all the time. And given that, how do you get people to drive? Well, how do you get people to walk or bike? The walk or the bike has to be as good as the drive. And to do that, it must do 4 things simultaneously, which is the structure of my book and the structure of this lecture. It must be useful, it must be safe, it must be comfortable, and it must be interesting. And this isn't really a hierarchy. If you don't do all four, people will get back in their cars or just choose not to make the walk. So the reason to walk is, a great story learned from my mentors, Andres and Liz. And if you've seen Andres or Liz speak, you'll recognize a lot of these slides. I show this image in every talk because honestly, this talk and all the talks I give are an evolution of me learning at DPZ to give Andres' talk for 10 years. So I always give full credit to the source. And I say, Andres used to give this talk called The Story of Planning, in which he discussed how, the planning movement began, the planning profession began when certain people noticed that people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills, and they said, hey, let's move the housing away from the mills. This is actually, looks beautiful, right? This is worker housing in England. And when they did so, as Andres would say, lifespans increased immediately and dramatically. And we like to say the planners have been trying to repeat that experience ever since. And the onset of Euclidean zoning, the division of the landscape into large areas of only single use. And we all know, if you go to planning school now, we all know this is wrong. But when you land as a designer, like me, on a site to do a plan for a property these days, there's already a plan like this waiting for you on it that you have to turn off before you can make a good plan. Because this is how we've planned the majority of the geographical area in this country. And I always say, I was an art history major, which doesn't count for much, they say, but you don't want a Rothko, you want a Seurat. Right? You don't want the blobs, you want the pointillism. And you want the most confetti-like, finest grain of uses, and the more confetti-like it is, the better. And of course, the red in the middle of this slide is vertically mixed use. So you actually have mixed use on the property. So that's the first lesson. The walk is only useful if you have many different uses close at hand. And then that gets into the argument that I don't think Andres has the patience to give this talk anymore, which is the towns versus sprawl lecture that is the ultimate foundation of CNU. And I haven't been here for the whole 101, so I presume you've gotten this already. But even if you have, you're getting it again. Because it's what drew us all to CNU, it's the fundamental message of CNU. And I should say it applies to the creation of new places. And this is the part of the talk where I just talk about new places, and I'll be done then, and I'll move entirely on to existing places, and specifically Detroit. But the fundamental new urbanist argument is there are only two tested ways to make communities throughout history and around the whole world, and they are the traditional neighborhood and suburban sprawl. That's it. There may be 100 ways to make a city, but there's only two that we've done by the thousands, and these are them. The neighborhood is defined as being compact, diverse, and walkable. It's almost always a 5-minute walk from edge to center, places to live and work and worship and shop and recreate, all within walking distance. Most of your daily needs are within walking distance. And then because there's so many streets, no one street needs to be that big. And so they're walkable, right? Compact, diverse, and walkable. Sprawl is the opposite in those three categories. The name tells you it's not compact. In terms of diversity, whole square miles will hold often just one use or one house over and over again, right? And then, this is important, there's a better pointer here. Because so few of the streets actually connect, right? Most of the streets are cul-de-sacs and loops. So because so few of the streets actually connect, they have the burden of handling all of the automotive throughput, and they're designed and engineered around that single goal. So we call them automotive sewers. And you can see, like sewers, they're noxious. The houses turn their backs to them. Imagine all this infrastructure, not a single address, right? It's all walls and backs. Incredibly inefficient. And you have the phenomenon of the cul-de-sac kid, because you will not, your kid is perfectly content in the cul-de-sac for about, 5 years. But then you can't give them any independence when they get older, because the rest of the network is absolutely deadly. So, the classic new urbanist slideshow, places where you only live, where you only work, where you only shop, supersizing of academic institutions. And school systems are still doing this consolidation thing. The more you consolidate, the more you separate. The bigger your school is, the further it is from you. And often the costs of busing are not calculated when schools make the decision to combine multiple schools together. And of course, the size of the parking lot compared to the size of the school tells you all you need to know about no child ever walking to that school. And the seniors and juniors are basically driving the freshmen and sophomores within the death rates to prove it. Same thing for athletic facilities. You know, Weston near Fort Lauderdale is very proud of their 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds. But this is why we have the soccer mom in America. Because when I was growing up, I had 2 soccer fields and 3 tennis courts and 1 baseball diamond, but they were all in my neighborhood. And now we consolidate, we supersize, and we separate. So this child, never mind that you can't, never mind that it's a mile to get there. But, you know, because this is a traffic sewer, and because it's serving so many people, essentially everyone is being driven to exercise. So the one part we forgot to count, if you separate everything from everything else, reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system becomes a commuting system. And I always tell people it's a 2-part dream, the American dream. Which, by the way, now they tell us only like 10% of Americans want houses where you can't walk to stuff. 10%. But that dream, if you want it, is a 2-part dream. You know, you can't have one without the other. So often to absurd extremes, Alice McLean took any of the apocryphal slides I'm showing you are by Alice McLean, the wonderful aerial photographer. But the investment we make, I finally figured this out. Like, why do we bankrupt our why do we bankrupt our civic coffers on this sort of horizontal infrastructure and rob our vertical infrastructure like town halls and churches and that sort of thing? You know, people drive in this to go to church in a corrugated metal box. Why do we do that? And the reason is that the landscape is so utterly banal and horrifying that if you have to wait more than 1 light cycle, you want to shoot yourself. So of course we can't let anyone do that. Walter Kulash took this slide back in 1988. We've been showing it ever since. There's a reason for this I can't explain, but the experience of being there, of course, is very frustrating. It's stressful on our families, right? When you're driving all the time, it's very stressful. You know, driving is no fun, and then being a pedestrian can be even. So, by the way, I'm happy to share my slides. I really don't own any of them. So if you, I'm going to give my Twitter handle at the end. I'm not giving it now because I don't want you like tweeting at me during my talk. But if any of you needs these slides, just let me know. And then the epidemiologist has been showing this slide for 15 years. You know, you've all seen this slide. Most places I go, most people have not yet seen this slide. And it's a Dick Jag, it's a Howie Frumpkin slide. And the point of the slide is, you know, the fact that we've created a society in which it seems normal to drive and park and take the escalator to the gym so that you can get on the treadmill and walk is why we have the most morbid society we've had in centuries. So this is the classic pair of diagrams, actually flawed because housing is missing, but you get the point. It's not what's in it, it's the same stuff, but what's its scale? Is it separated? And is it a dendritic branching road system in which every trip depends on this one collector? Or is it a network of streets? And those are the 2 models. And it's important to discuss because, you know, everywhere is still building sprawl. And I think it's amazing now, looking back at CNU after decades, that almost every major city has 1 or several new urban communities that are pretty darn good. It's amazing to have seen that. But people are still building sprawl, you know, at 100 times the rate of that. So it's important to have this conversation wherever you go. But now we should move on and talk about what does this mean? What does the useful mean? What does the useful walk mean when you're talking about an existing community like the downtown of Detroit? And essentially, it's about the balance of uses within the area that you hope to make walkable. Now, I always end up focusing on downtowns, or the old downtowns, or the old main streets. I always end up focusing, I think most of us who do this work end up focusing on the commercial areas. Because walkability requires mixed use, it's almost impossible to integrate other uses into residential areas. I'm sure you've had that experience. Try to put a 7-Eleven in a cul-de-sac and see what happens to you. There's a homeowners associations and everyone else is scared of other stuff. But what's very easy is taking our old commercial centers, where there's already a little bit of housing, and working towards a better balance of uses there. So you look at all the uses, and these aren't all of them, but you look at the list of uses, and you say what is missing or underrepresented, and almost always it's housing. There's very, very few cities like San Francisco where the housing is actually outpacing the jobs. This is, of course, in the central parts of the city or the other places where walkability is possible. And when you bring the housing back, everything else starts firing on more cylinders. Jane Jacobs, talking about Wall Street, when it was a very different place back in the 60s, said, you know, why are there no great restaurants in Wall Street? Why is there no great gym? in Wall Street, because it takes lunchtime and evening activity to really support a great restaurant or gym. And that's what happens, and I've seen it in our work in Oklahoma City, I've seen it over and over again. When you bring more housing into a place, the other stuff starts to kick in. Now, what's downtown and midtown? So, obviously, the greater downtown, not obviously, if you're not from here, but the greater downtown of Detroit is more than just downtown and midtown, but that's the place where walkability seems to be happening and most possible in the short term. And by the way, most cities where I work are very interested in 3 to 5 years. No one wants 20-year plans anymore. Have you noticed that? 3 to 5 years, we're competing now for the millennials, and in 20 years, who knows, it'll all be underwater anyway, right? So, so in downtown and midtown, you have 136,000 jobs, and you have 24,000 residents. So that's a ratio of 5.7 to 1, which isn't half as bad as, say, a Midtown Atlanta or other places, but it's a ratio, the closer you get it to 1 to 1, the healthier, more walkable place you have. So you need to really put the effort into making the housing happen. You just a city should find ways to subsidize attainable housing in their downtown cores. This blew my mind. I know you can't read this in back. This can't possibly be true, but it says downtown, 4.3 people per acre. Midtown, 8.7 people per acre. This is 4.3 people per acre. This is 8.7 people per acre. So you're looking at, in downtown and midtown, the walkable heart of Detroit, you're looking at this sort of densities. You want to have a supermarket? How about a corner? In residential subdivisions, this won't support a corner store, right? So there's a clear pressure to get more residents downtown. And then you have this is the downtown area, this is the midtown area. And there's more over here, but this is where most of the growth is possible. And then you have this happening, where of course, and I've seen this in cities from San Francisco to Davenport, Iowa, any residential unit they build in the downtown gets rented up immediately. The issue isn't whether it will sell, the issue is whether it can be delivered to market at an attainable rate. And that's the challenge that cities, if they want, again, I place everything in this framework. Do you want to be more walkable? If cities want to be more walkable, then they will subsidize more housing, do everything they can to get as much more housing in their downtowns as fast as possible. Another part of the useful walk argument is transit. I like to say, you can have a perfectly walkable neighborhood without transit, but a walkable city relies on transit tremendously. Because if you don't connect the walkable parts to each other, people want to have access to the whole city. This is my experience living in Miami, where I was single and I wanted to have access to the whole city. If you don't connect the different walkable places to each other with transit, then people will buy a car. They'll find a way to have a complete access. And then your city just shapes itself around the cars. So transit is super important. This is the new light rail that's going to be going up and down Woodward, which is a fantastic concept. And it's the right kind. There was a wonderful Brookings report that I talk about in my book that describes the experience of the successful recent transit systems like Portland and Seattle, and describes how they were paid for by the people who owned this property, right? They're connecting this to this. And the principal payment is coming from people who stand to benefit from the pedestrian, what's called, transit's really called a pedestrian accelerator, right? That kind of transit, streetcars. Streetcars are not high speed, are not really commuting transit. They're pedestrian accelerators that extend your reach as a pedestrian. And it's these folks who are going to benefit tremendously, just as the people in the Pearl District in Portland, or the, South Lake Union District in Seattle, benefited from connecting the heart of the city to their neighborhood. And that's who's principally paid for it. And that's super smart. That's why I have great confidence in this system, which looks great. But it's being paid for by Quicken Loans. And they're calling it the Q train. But I think, understanding the concept of pedestrian accelerator, I think we should just call it the Quickener. And then BRT, if you're from Detroit, you're aware there's a huge referendum that's about to go on the ballot. I think $4 billion. Is that right? 4? 2.9. I don't know how you spend $2.9 billion on buses. I don't. But clearly, if you want to have a regional transit system, that's effective, it's a great idea. And I would support that. And then the last point I make in this category is that bike share is transit. Don't let people try to put bike share in its own category as some investment that you should make to make your city cuter or more attractive to millennials. What we're finding in the cities that have an active, effective bike share policy, a large one, or I should say bike share network, is that it's do you know what it is? There are all these things that all add up to the non-car owning lifestyle. Zipcar, Car2Go, Uber, bike share, bicycle facilities and pedestrian facilities, those are all mutually reinforcing. And buses and trains. It's all mutually reinforcing. You have two choices, really. You can invest in the automotive city, which harms all those things, or you can invest in any one of these things. And what it does is it frees people from car ownership. And then they end up taking transit, they end up using bikes, they end up walking, they end up doing all these things. It's important to understand there's only two envelopes, and one is massive and the other is just cars. All right, so now we're about to do the last two categories. The useful walk and the interesting walk are quite short, and most of this talk is focused on the safe walk, because it's the biggest impediment to walkability in most of our cities. Additionally, of the four, the useful, safe, comfortable, and interesting walk, the safe walk is the one the city controls now, right? The useful walk, the comfortable walk, and the interesting walk are a function of mostly what's lining the streets, and that's principally the private sector. Now, the city, through its subsidization, through its codes, can control that or influence it. But the one thing the city can do right away, through the investments it's making every day, is to make the streets more safe. And so that's where I focus my talk, and that's where most cities I work with are focusing their efforts. So it all surrounds this diagram and the concept of design speed. And the understanding that a car going 35 miles an hour is 8 times as likely to kill you as a car going 25 miles an hour. So everything we do has to be designed to convince the drivers to move more slowly. And someone once asked me, does any of this urban planning stuff matter anymore now that no one's looking up from their phones? I said, yes, it matters even more. These are just sitting ducks for our 35 mile an hour vehicles, as are our elderly citizens. And this is the basic message. Someone hacked into the system. So the first measure is block size. This is Portland, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. This is Salt Lake City, famously less walkable, famously 600-foot blocks. You may recall when we were there that there are some intersections that give you orange flags to hold up as you cross the street in Salt Lake City. Because a 600-foot block city is basically a 6-lane city. And a 200-foot block city, isn't it amazing that Americans built both of these things? They're so different, right? But a 200-foot block city can be a 2-lane city. And most of the streets in Portland are 1 to 2 lanes. This is the statistics these are the statistics. I just saw Norm Garrick outside. 24 different California cities. When you double the block size, you quadruple almost the number of non-highway fatalities. So a clear inverse proportion between safety and block size. Here's Detroit. Darn good. This great old grid, right? 200 feet is right there. So it's about, the smallest blocks are like 230, maybe by 230. Here's Portland next to Detroit. And of course, Portland is the extreme. So Detroit has, this is where I say, you've got good bones. You've got a framework that will support walkability. And then you have the cases where you've been allowed to supersize, consolidate 4 blocks or more into one, and those are the least walkable parts of the city. So here's Salt Lake City, and there's part of downtown Detroit. So the first lesson is, don't consolidate blocks. And then here's MIDTOWN, which, while mostly burnt out, has still this nice small blocks ready to accept healthy walkable development. And then this is where I have to talk about your incredible grid, drawn by Augustus Woodward. I'm amazed. There's Augustus, a little blurry. I'm amazed that this is an 1805 plan. If that's only like 7 years after L'Enfant, it is so much more elegant and sophisticated and beautiful. And this guy wasn't an architect, he wasn't an artist, he was a judge. Now I have to say, I think it's very disorienting getting around here. I think once you've lived here, it's probably okay. For a visitor, Andres Duani used to say, you don't want to get on the street and have it go north, and then west, and then south. It's very disorienting. But it is a beautiful diagram. And it makes for nice small blocks. It also makes for unusually shaped blocks, like this one. A few people have already been tweeting pictures of this wonderful building. And that makes much more interest in the architecture. I am a fan of triangular blocks. Those of you who know about my house will attest. They make really neat buildings. But that itself is phenomenal and makes Detroit unique, and it has a lot of fans. So this is not a real tattoo, it's just a proposal. It's like he's a planner, he won't really do it, he just proposed it. And then this network used to be super walkable, right? This was Detroit, and now to a large extent this is Detroit. We all know it's coming back marvelously. But there's this great diagram, I think it's Street's blog, where you can move the toggle, right? Then and now. Right? Then and now. And of course what Detroit did, as much as any other city, probably more, was to completely blow itself out with highways and parking lots. And, you know, the #1 source of used bricks, if you want to build something with historic brick in the US, I believe is St. Louis. But the #1 source of ruin porn is Detroit. Because you have things like this and this. And you know, you've all seen these pictures, you don't need me to show them to you again, except, you know, for the nation's for the inventor of the automobile, for the people who brought us this national scourge, the greatest health and environmental and economic crisis an aesthetic nightmare that Americans have ever experienced, I just say, oh, the irony that Detroit did it to itself worse than anybody. But of course now, it's getting better. Next, we talked about the size of blocks. Now the size of the streets. Obviously, the more the street looks like a highway, the more people drive like a highway, the less safe it feels to cross. And no one's crossing this street, but people are crossing this street. And the number of lanes is something you can't discuss without discussing the concept of induced demand. Who has not seen this slide? Okay, don't be shy, it's all right, some of you. So this is the slide that Walter Kulash and Rick Choman and the other new urbanists first showed me, probably in 1988 or something. And this is another conversation that's really important to have in your communities about this concept of induced demand, which is one of two great black holes in transportation planning. Historically, black holes in the thinking of transportation planners, who did for many years, and by the way, everything I've learned to attack traffic engineers, I learned from traffic engineers. So there are good ones out there and in here. In fact, all the good ones are in here. If you're not in here, you're not a good one, right? But the fundamental misunderstanding, the thought that environment does not impact behavior, is the source of how traffic engineers make streets too big and how they make them too fast. In the case of induced demand, it is an expectation that as you increase capacity to absorb trips, that you can succeed at doing that, ignoring, and here's the key phrase that you need to remember, that in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. Often the only constraint to driving. In a nation that subsidizes driving to such a great degree, the only constraint to driving is the misery of being stuck in traffic. And therefore, when you reduce the traffic, people change their behaviors. They commute more on peak, they choose not to bike or take transit or carpool, they move further away from their jobs. And this happens ad infinitum. And we now know this happens all the time. Newsweek magazine years ago, so today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. But it's not the engineers you find in most communities, because most engineers in most communities are answering to the citizens, and the citizens don't get it. And the citizens say, we need more lanes because the traffic is coming, and you put the lanes down, and the traffic comes, and they say, see, we told you so. And so engineers around this country who understand induced demand still daily are making decisions as if they don't understand induced demand. Here's the study presented at the Paris School of Economics, very straightforward. I have no idea what this means, but I do know what this means, which is the data set says that for each mile of new capacity you add, you get 40%, it's 40% matched with new trips right away. And within 4 years, it's 100% matched with new trips. And then there have been some cases, like the 405 in LA, and the Katy Freeway in Houston, where immediately, they spend billions of dollars, $8.2 billion in Houston, and immediately there's more congestion than before they started doing this incredibly expensive expansion that was justified on the basis of traffic. You've probably heard this from the AICP report. 15 years ago, maybe, the more your city spends on reducing congestion, the longer commute you buy your citizens. And that's about all you achieve. So you look at Detroit, and you see that you are thoroughly girded. You've done you have a complete job of highways. So there's no more that you can possibly do except to widen them. And the basic message is that you can stop now. You need to see that again. You can stop now. But there's a larger discussion, which you find in this report, which was done by New Urbanist, Mark Nikita and his crew and others, in 2006, quite some time ago. And it says something very similar to what most New Urbanist reports say, which is that, look, you've got this network of highways. Let them handle the speedy through traffic, and understand that takes the burden off your local streets. You don't need both highways that look like highways and local streets that look like highways. And so the local streets, starting in 2006, but picking up a lot of steam in recent years, the local streets, they're doing road diets here, and they're narrowing them. So you have roads like Warren, which don't need to be highways. Roads like Fort, which unfortunately is also called M85, which means what? Right, the state owns it. But just because the state owns it doesn't mean it's a highway. If you live in Florida, the state owns like everything, right? So there's no reason why it has to be designed as a highway. And the city, thanks to this plan, is already beginning the process of right-sizing the streets to the traffic that's on them. Now, I make the induced demand argument everywhere I go, and then I move on, because it's like, you can win a room, but you can't win a community on induced demand. If they're not in the room, they don't agree. And so I say, fine, let's do something else, which is let's look at the streets. This is Oklahoma City. Let's look at the streets you've got. I'm sure some of them, unless you're in New York City, I'm sure some of the streets you've got are not congested at peak hour. And I know that's the case in Detroit, where the city was sized for this incredible economic energy, which went away. It's creeping back now, but the streets are now much, much bigger than the city needs. And that was certainly the case in Oklahoma City, where the mayor called me very upset because Prevention Magazine, in its Best Walking Cities issue, named Oklahoma City the worst city for pedestrians in the entire country, which kind of sucks, right? I said, help, what do we do? And I said, you need a walkability study. I'd never done one, and didn't know what it meant. But we looked at the downtown core and the car counts in the downtown core, and notice they've got nice small blocks, and the car counts are quite low. Any engineer, good or bad, will tell you that a 2-lane street can handle 10,000 cars per day. 2 lanes, 10,000 cars. And we looked at these counts, 9,000, 6,000, 4,000, 5,000, 7,000 downtown, and then I looked at the brand new downtown master plan for the city, which had designated these streets to be arterials and to maintain a 4 to 6 lane width. Sheridan at 10,000, Hudson at 8,000, right? These are 4 to 6 lane streets carrying 2 lanes of traffic. And for example, this street, this 6-laner, where you're not allowed to park here during rush hour, was carrying 8,000 cars per day. By the way, we're about to do it in Des Moines. So I said, let's right-size the streets to the traffic that they're actually expected. Not now, it's going to grow, but expecting a reasonable amount of growth, let's right-size the streets. And fortunately, the day that I released my walkability study, roughly, Devon Energy decided to build this 60-story tower in the heart of the downtown that was generating $180 million in tax increment. And they asked the question, what can we spend this on? And the leadership said, let's rebuild all the city streets in the central business district, from building face to building face. So my job was to basically design the curb to curb of each street. And in so doing, I was able to double the amount of on-street parking from 800 to 1,600 spaces and create a bike network where there was 0 bike network. So a typical street like this becomes this. Here it is under construction. And a street like this, which is the main arterial through downtown, had to maintain 5 lanes at intersections, but we were able to make it much better, put in bike lanes and a median except for the corners. So this is a very expensive, if you've got a lot of money, which by the way Oklahoma City doesn't anymore, because oil is peaking at $50 a barrel, and this job now in Oklahoma City is about 2/3 done, and we'll see if it gets finished. But this is a very unusual condition, and I don't use this as something to show without showing a more normal condition, which is something like Cedar Rapids. In Cedar Rapids, they had the same condition, from farm boom to farm bust. Streets were much bigger than they needed to be. Almost every street in downtown was 4 lanes, and they didn't need to be more than 2. They were about to spend $3 million to rebuild this one street as one of these pretty streets with pocket parking and beautiful new trees and all that sort of thing. And I said, why rebuild one street when for the same amount of money you can restripe the whole downtown? And that's, people always say, oh, I've got the money, so I'm rebuilding. I'm like, why not take that money and restripe? Because you can restripe 20 times as much rather than rebuilding. So in this plan, we're going from half one-way and almost all 4-lane to all 2-way, and except for the state highway, all 2-lane. And that gets us from this much parking, where red is angle, to this much parking, and from this much biking to this much biking. And they're slowly doing this with money that's, go Cedar Rapids. They're slowly doing this with public works money that's coming up anyway. There's no specific funding for this, just when they restripe it the right way. And we're getting rid of 11 out of 17 signals in the downtown and replacing them with 4-way stop signs, because you can do that when you've not reduced the number of lanes. Now, one-way, as you all know, one-way streets are like, if I have a rubber stamp, it's the 1-way to 2-way rubber stamp. Because there used to be a rubber stamp that went 2-way to 1-way and destroyed our cities, and you know it. And the thing that most communities I go to are able to do, if they're not doing already, is convert their heinous 1-way systems, where each street feels like a highway, back to the 2-ways they used to be. And the data is now coming in. So in Louisville, Kentucky, where Brooks and First were converted back to 2-way, and 2nd and 3rd weren't, car crashes went down by 48% on the 2-ways, crime went down 23%, and on the 1-ways, car crashes went up and crime went up. The best known example, which I talk about in my book, was Vancouver, Washington, where Alan Ehrenholt did this article that was very influential in Governing Magazine, talking about Vancouver, Washington, where they tried all the tricks of the 80s to revive a dead Main Street that was 1-way. The bricks, the berms, the bollards, the bandstands, the balloons, and something else beginning with B. And it didn't work. And then they went to 2-way. And according to the merchants, the same number of cars, but split now between 2 directions, their revenues doubled. So lots of evidence. This is in one community I was working in the neighborhood. The neighbors put this up. The residents want 2-way streets. And then you look at Detroit, and you see in the heart of the downtown, this process has been underway. I believe 2nd and 3rd have already been reverted. You see a few other streets, though, like part of Grand River, Clifford, 2nd, that are still 1-way and should be changed. So here's Grand River, here's Clifford, and they feel more like highways. Here's a 1-laner, but it's a 1-way. That's wide enough to be 2-way, right? So that's clear. Next, the classic American road diet. That is such a fun and easy thing to do. And it's more applicable in older communities that don't have center turn lanes in every street, but it applies to the classic 4-lane street, which is very dangerous because when this car stops for you to turn, this car hits you. It's also very inefficient because the turning lane is also the speeding lane, and the speeding lane is also the turning. So this doesn't surprise anyone. When you do this and gain 11 feet for bike lanes or parking or something else, of course the injuries drop precipitously. But this is what surprised everyone. This is 17 different road diets documented by the folks who started at Gliding Jackson. And the ADT, the average daily trips before and after, are essentially the same. If you add the 2 columns up, the after is higher. So it's amazing, you do not lose capacity. So whenever you have a 4-laner, like Werner, I picked a spot people would recognize, the Mr. Fish. Whenever you have a 4-lane, it can be a 3-lane tomorrow, and it will be much safer. You can get bike lanes out of the deal, and you will not lose capacity. The only argument against doing it is that we don't have the money to do it right now. The width of the lanes is the next item. Lane width. Andres used to show this slide and say, the typical road, the typical subdivision in America is wide enough to allow you to witness the curvature of the earth. And I still say that. And it's amazing though, there's been this mission creep. So here's a subdivision from the 80s, and here's a subdivision from the 2000s. Look at the width of this, 60s and 80s. 60s, look at the same height of helicopter. Look at the width of the street, 80s. Just, they've gotten wider and wider and wider. And Rick Hall and John Anderson and everyone else can tell you why. I don't have time today. Even my old street in South Beach, when it wasn't draining properly and they had to rebuild it for the drainage, we lost half our sidewalk and all our street trees because this new standard kicked in. And that happens everywhere. A wider street is a faster street. And the drivers know it. Drivers know a 12-foot lane is a highway speed lane and a 10-foot lane is an urban speed lane. And yet most cities still have a 12-foot rule. Many cities still have a 12-foot rule, or at least an 11-foot rule for their downtown lanes, when 10 feet used to be the standard and is now becoming the standard again. One study said increased lane widths are responsible for 900 additional fatalities a year. And my question is just how long do we have to keep experiencing this problem before we put the corrective measures in? And of course, different cities are doing it at different speeds. Citizens fight for it in Birmingham, Michigan. And then this is blurry because it was bootleg. Someone stole this from me from a conference. The fellow who was writing the ITE Traffic Engineering Handbook, 7th edition, includes this very important sentence. 10 feet should be the default width for general purpose lanes at speeds of 45 miles per hour or less. Which says two things. It says 10 feet's okay. It also says if you make it more than 10, you want people to go more than 45. You want people to go more than 45. The severity of impact in a 12-foot lane is 10 times the severity of impact in a 10-foot lane, according to one study. And then there's streets like this in Detroit, and I couldn't figure out what the standard was. Because you have streets like Charlevoix, which are 12.5-foot lanes, right? And then streets like Honorary, which I showed you, which is one roughly 25-foot lane, right? And then streets like Forest, which are 10-foot lanes. So 10-foot lanes are clearly allowed here. So if anyone tells you, oh no, we have to use 11, and I was talking to some urbanists from here who said actually the city does not use a 10-foot lane. Well, the city does use a 10-foot lane. So there's no reason why we can't have 10-foot lanes moving forward. Cycling. Next. Cycling is the biggest you know this as planners, is the biggest revolution in planning currently underway in only some American cities, right? And the cities that focused on it first, like Portland, who spent $65 million over 20 years, have fundamentally changed how people live in their cities. And so in Portland, they used to bike almost the same as the rest of America. And now they bike like 10 times as much as the rest of America. I asked my friend Tom Brennan at Nelson Nygaard to send me some pictures of the Portland bike commute. And he sent me these photos. I said, oh, is this bike to work day? He said, no, this is Tuesday in Portland. It's just normal. And the lesson we're learning is that the bike population follows the bike investment. Climate matters a little, topography matters a little, culture matters a little, investment matters the most, and like overpowers everything else. These are Rahm Emanuel's new bike lanes in Chicago. Here they are now. They went back and painted them green. This is Prospect Park West, one of Jeanette Sadiq-Khan's projects that she'll probably talk to us about. 3 lanes became 2. A buffered bike lane. This is what I miss in Oklahoma City, because it was, 8 years ago. This is what Detroit is just now catching up on, is that to really get a broad demographic of cyclists, to get women and children cycling, and then to get people into their basement, to pull out their bikes and to become cyclists again, you need the buffered, protected bike lanes. Or else everyone you get is the mammals, right? The middle-aged men in Lycra. Those are your own Lycra. So, of course, the number of cyclists tripled. Of course, speeding dropped. But look at this, from 75% to 17% of all vehicles. Injury crashes to all users went down by almost 2/3. But then, remarkably, this street handles as many cars per hour at rush hour as that street does. And I think, and Rick, we can talk about it later, but I think the reason for this is that because when cars go slower, their spacing becomes shorter. Rick's nodding. Their spacing becomes shorter. And when they speed up, their spacing becomes longer. And actually, as they go faster, they need more roadway. So it's amazing that they're carrying as many trips here as they were here. So again, a win-win-win. Win-win, it's a win-win-win-win. And then, of course, people say, should we paint them green? And I say, I don't know, do you want to advertise your city? Do you want to boost your city? Do you want to attract young people to your city? Do you want to say that you have a healthy, young, future-looking city? Then your bike lanes are horizontal billboards that say we're that kind of city. And so I'm all for painting them bright green or bright something. If, however, you believe, like Pasadena does, that every lane is a bike lane, then really no lane is a bike lane. And the vehicular cyclists, here we can applaud, if you know what I'm talking about. The vehicular cyclist day is over. Yay. Vehicular cyclists used to dominate the whole conversation on biking and said, oh no, I don't want a separate but equal lane off to the side. I demand that I share with cars, but of course that's failed for 50 years. So if you believe that every lane is a bike lane, then this is the only cyclist you have in your community. And that's who I met in Pasadena. It's not a cult. Weather is not all that important. This is a map of the warmest to the coldest states, and completely uncorrelated with that map is biking population, because it's a function of investment. And then, of course, tech companies want it. They want to attract young talent, educated talent. And now here in downtown Detroit, this is probably a little out of date, but this is only a few years ago. There are only 14 miles of bike lanes in downtown Detroit. They've made great progress. And there's the, how do you pronounce this? The DeQuinder Trail. Spectacular. It's a little bit to the side of where we really want it to be, but it's fantastic. But the typical, just like I would have done them 8 years ago, the typical bike lane isn't properly buffered. So on a street like 2nd Avenue, there's every opportunity to pull the parking off the curb and to put the bike lane against the curb. And I understand there's some new bike lanes being built in the city that are based on that model. But my main message is, just do more of it faster, please. And invest in the green paint. We're almost done with this category. Parallel parking is a barrier of steel, an essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. It's almost always necessary. This is happy hour in Fort Lauderdale. Notice parallel parking here, no parallel parking there. This is happy hour on the parallel park side. This is happy hour on the non-park side. No one wants to be sitting within 4 feet of a car going, 40 miles an hour. The other part of the conversation is the trees. Studies, engineers used to fight against trees. They were FHOs, fixed and hazardous objects. They were dangerous to drive near because you might hit them. But in fact, we've now learned from several studies that that there are fewer injury accidents on streets with trees than streets without trees, because trees slow cars down, sometimes dramatically. Better a tree than a person. And then this is the feeling, right? This is the feeling you get when a street has neither trees nor parked cars. This is the feeling, let's put the trees on the other side of the street, and let's put the light pole in the middle of the sidewalk. Force you on the edge, right? This is Brush Street. But then there are new streets in Detroit, like Madison, still no parallel parking, which would be easy to fix with a road diet, a 4-to-3 road diet, but doing it properly. These are young, but the trees and the planting between the sidewalk and the street. Then there's the matter of vocabulary, which we designers and new urbanists are very interested in. This is what I call objective journalism. This is the Las Vegas Sun describing the kind of failing addition to the Strip in Las Vegas. Some say the entrance to City Center is not inviting to pedestrians. Oh, really? And this is a conversation that Andres has been having for years about when you have stream-form geometrics, when things are swoops and aerodynamic, then it communicates a language of automotive motion, a dynamic automotive environment, as opposed to a static pedestrian environment. So I always look, every city's got one. It's usually from the 80s or 90s. This is just a little bit east of downtown. And yeah, this is where you speed up because you get to feel the G-forces as you go around the curve. And it just clearly is not a walking kind of street. Signals. This is art. This is not a real, this is a roundabout signal. It's art. But if you haven't heard, we're vastly over-signalized in this country. And the new roundabout, I'm convinced, is the four-way stop, which, by the way, is a much more static and walkable environment than even the best roundabout. The four-way stop, everyone stops. There's never a high-speed collision in a four-way stop unless someone is breaking the law, right? And the bicyclists just blow through. If you're a bicyclist, you know this. You just blow through it. And there's a ton of eye contact between everybody. But the statistics have been in now for some time, since 1997, when they removed 472 signals and converted signalized intersections to four-way stops. And when they did that and collected data on almost 200, crashes went down 24%, severe injury crashes down 63%, severe pedestrian injury crashes down 68%. So anywhere you can replace a signal with a four-way stop, you're probably saving lives and also making a much more walkable environment. This is funny. Traffic engineers in Philadelphia believe that the safety benefit stems from the elimination of the local habit of speeding up to beat the red. Because only in Philadelphia do they do that. So stop. Here's just a funny one that you learn new stuff every year. A year ago I learned that, this is British so they're on the wrong side. A year ago I learned that when you remove the center line from a street, you reduce driver's speed by 7 miles an hour. So do that. Don't do it on major thoroughfares, but if a street isn't carrying a ton of traffic and you're repaving it, take the center line off. And then, our old slide, the poor woman struggling up the curb in Tampa. This is the slide that DPZers would show and say, we can't let the specialists design our city. We need generalists designing our city. Because yes, this street will be bone dry within 30 seconds of the 100-year flood, but it has to function in the non-emergency condition as well. So that's it. Now I'm going to finish up very quickly with the comfortable walk and the interesting walk. The comfortable walk is a little counterintuitive because we like our wide open spaces, but we also like to feel contained. And the evolutionary biologists tell us that all animals, we among them, are simultaneously seeking prospect and refuge. We want to see our predators, and we want to know that our flanks are covered from attack. And if our flanks don't feel covered, we do not feel comfortable. And so, the classic CNU diagram, what's the best ratio? 3 to 1 is great, 1 to 1 is the Renaissance ideal. Beyond 6 to 1, you don't really feel enclosed anymore, although trees help. And then some new urbanists posted this. This is a kind of a fake wedding photo. But the point being, you don't want to be in a place that doesn't have that good spatial definition for your wedding photo or for anything else. So 6 to 1 is Salzburg, delightful. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. Now, this is an old slide of Houston. Houston's doing much, much better. But the reason I show this slide is to remind us that it's the surface parking lot that's the principal villain in this conversation. No one wants to walk next to this because you do not feel enclosed. And so, of course, what's happened in Detroit between surface parking lots and just abandoned properties is a key inhibitor of walkability. And then we all know the best streets. They're easy to find in any city. The best streets are the ones that are just so well shaped on both sides. The interesting walk just takes it a step further and says, we humans were among the social primates. Nothing interests us more than other humans. We want signs of humanity, or we will turn around and go home. And so, this is a 1-to-1 ratio in Grand Rapids, very walkable downtown, but no one wants to walk on this street, which connects the 2 best hotels in Grand Rapids, because when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck, and the other side is a hotel conference facility that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck, then, and this is where we say, what are the architects doing in our cities, right? And we have to get into architecture and having lively edges of buildings against the street. And this is Charleston, where Mayor Riley, who you'll hear from tonight, taught us, it only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 foot of garage, right? This is the version they built in Miami Beach. I call it the Chia Pet Garage. Same idea, shops, setback. And every city, it's very easy to poke fun. Every city has them. Detroit has a lot of them. The parking lot's right up against the edge of the street. And thank goodness I'm on Twitter and follow Mike Lydon, because he sent this morning. He tweeted this morning. What a great space, but clearly not an A street, right? And by the way, every city has streets like this. As long as there's a network of walkability, you can have B streets that are not walkable. So, and then finally, so I was 4 years at the National Endowment for the Arts, where I funded a lot of public art, and I was proud to do it. But you know, there's been an evolution in public art from what used to be plop art, right? The sculpture landing on the plaza as it dropped from an airplane. And there's been an evolution in thinking now. You know, many cities have these mural programs going. But if you're approaching the world through a walkability lens, as we new urbanists do, then it's important, I think, to direct your art budget to those stretches along your walkable network that are just boring because they're blank walls. And so again, if walkability is your goal, then your art budget becomes directed towards murals in boring places. So this is the American version. This is the European version. But you know, take care of it, keep it clean, you know. And that's it. So this is the. So this is the full list, and what I'm not going to get into is the concept of urban triage and how you pick your winners and connect things along a smaller network that can be excellent in short order, because you can't make the whole city walkable at once. You need to decide where it's going to have the most impact. I would think in conjunction with your new light rail, and create a network which is integrated into itself. But that's that. The city has come so far. And I've been coming back every few years for the last decade, and it's amazing to see it changed so quickly. Clearly there's a lot more to be done. I hope I've helped folks think about what to do first. There's the book that I hope you will read. If you haven't read it yet, I'm doing a book signing right now. If you want to talk to me or get a book signed, I will talk to you if you don't buy a book. It's preferred. Right out there. And then, and since I'm among friends, I just want to say, I'm extremely proud that I've taken what I've learned from all of you, and created the book, which is the best-selling and most popularly reviewed planning book of its time. And I say it's time because the one that it's replaced is this one, which has sold more copies because it's been out since 2000. If you have not read Suburban Nation, you are not a new urbanist. I'm sorry. They're selling that also. And then they only have 3 of these left, so don't buy this book. But that's the Smart Growth Manual, which does not aspire, as these two do, to be a work of literature, but you can read it in one flight. So that's why I recommend that book. And then finally, it's too late for you, unless you're crazy, to sign up for, next week I'm teaching a course at Harvard that's 2 days of this. No, you're welcome there, I just assume none of you can make it. But if you want 2 days of this, I'll be doing it again next year, date to be determined. And you can find out about anything I've talked about, steal my slides, or otherwise get in touch with my Twitter handle, which is Jeff Speck, AICP. And now I think I'm done. Oh, and if you tweet at me, you can do what a number of people are doing now, is they take pictures of the book while they're driving. That's a thing. It's a thing now. So enjoy your CNU now. Well, thank you for your attention.